You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley. And once again, we have my wife, Cassandra. How are you?
Doing good.
We went from, I had a few guests, 3 this year. Then I think I had to do a solo one. And then you told me, you're like, I don't know if I have enough time. And I was like, oh crap, I got to do it by myself. But we've been able to record these together. So we appreciate, on behalf of all our listeners, you being here. So last week we had an interesting topic. And so this week and next week, we're going to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about things that I hear from my clients all the time that aren't necessarily mold related. But today's topic is managing stress associated with toxic mold sickness. And the reason we're kind of just pivoting for a few episodes, you're a coach.
Yeah.
Is it a life coach? Is that what you call yourself?
When I first started coaching probably 17 or 18 years ago, I was a business coach and then a life coach. And then I've come back and I mostly coach women on how to build online businesses. But health comes into it constantly.
Right.
And my next evolution of coaching, I'm moving much more towards the health integrative functional medicine coaching for women over 40. So that's my next shift in coaching. So I love this topic. I love anything health coaching related.
You know, for our listeners, obviously we're going to talk about mold, but I just wanted to talk about things that a lot of our listeners probably deal with. And, you know, it's something I hear all the time. And from my perspective, you know, my clients say it all the time, like, you have no idea how stressful this is. And I don't, because I'm a mold remediation contractor. This is what I deal with all the time. For them, and it's difficult because I understand, like, this is a life-changing experience. But on the other hand, it's, you know, they have to understand too that we're a business and this is how we operate. And I guess the reason I'm bringing that up is, you know, sometimes I have clients that are like, we're so stressed out but we don't have the money. Can you just rent us air scrubbers or do this? Like, you have no idea how stressful it is, Steve. And it's like, I understand, but I once again, I have to run the business how I run it. But my point is the stress side of things is very, very prominent with those that are exposed to mold. So, you know, the first question, or the first thing I wanted to bring up is, you know, why are we talking about it?
Well, I think because in general, we live today in a very stressful environment, and human beings were not meant to have prolonged years of stress. We were meant to have a stressful incident, like running from a tiger, get to safety, calm down, and resume life until the next, like, we were meant to have breaks. And we live in a world and a time where there's no break. Your phone is showing you all kinds of things that are stressful. Every time there's a beep, a ding, a zing, all of these things to a nervous system that still is in caveman times means that we are being shot with stress everywhere you turn around. Now
Yeah.
you add somebody who's dealing with mold sickness. And so they have all of these joint pain, brain fog, depression, anxiety, plus the anger of not feeling heard and not being able to figure out how to heal. And oftentimes losing a lot in the process, losing jobs, losing homes, losing marriages. You have all of that in toxic mold. And now the person is trying to figure out how to pay the next bill, but pay the next mold remediation contractor, pay the next medical doctor to do the next, like it just is a never ending vicious cycle of stress.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I kind of hear, as a man, we just hear what we want to hear, but I'm hearing you say like, we're doing this to ourselves. And I feel the same way when I talk about indoor air quality. We talk about indoor air quality, EMFs, VOCs, mold, bacteria, endotoxins. I'm only going to speak specifically to more of the mold side, but our listeners understand what I'm going to say. We're doing this to ourselves too when it comes to indoor air quality.
Absolutely. And then you have, if we're dealing with women, you have hormonal changes, whether that's because you've just had a baby or because you're perimenopausal or menopausal. We have teenagers and 20-somethings who have fertility challenges, which I remember we had Dr. Fox on the first time, and she talked about the fact that she recommends that women actually prep for getting pregnant so they could deal with all of the toxicity issues. Because then if you're in a mold infested home and you are pregnant and you have the baby, now you're worried about the health of the baby.
Yeah.
So there's lots of stress to go around when dealing with mold.
Yeah. And it's, for our listeners, like, I get it. I haven't gone through it. We talked about this last week. I'm not mold sensitive. Obviously, I couldn't do the job I do. But I get it. And it's difficult for me to understand sometimes when I'm dealing with clients that have brain fog or anxiety, anger, things like that. But I get it. Like, I understand it's stressful for you. And, I try to do everything I can to, I'm not going to say alleviate. We can't remove it all, but to help lessen that burden. And the interesting part is, like, when I talked to, I can't remember whether it was Heather or Dr. Fox. I don't think it was Dr. Diane, but when we talked about the whole medical side of things, they referred to it as like a bucket. And so we have our bucket, and your normal things, keep that bucket half full, quarter full, 3/4 full. But once that bucket overflows, that's when we start seeing all the issues, like the anxiety and all that. And so for me, and this is just what I do for a career, I want to keep that bucket from overfilling, and maybe mold exposure is what overfills that bucket.
Absolutely.
And it's funny because I actually Googled it when I was preparing for the podcast, because this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I had the question, like, how does stress affect your body after you're exposed to mold? So I Googled it, and it pulled up 3 things. And when I told you, you're like, yeah, because you know this stuff. But it can affect you in 3 different ways: physical, emotional, and behavioral. And so for the physical side, that's the headaches, the high blood pressure. Emotional side, anxiety, depression, panic attacks. And then the behavioral side, anger, overeating, things like that. Something I kind of wanted to talk about while we're talking about this topic is, last week we talked about how maybe only one person in the home's experiencing mold sickness. And it could be, underlying autoimmune disorders. Maybe there's I'm sure our listeners know this, but and I think Dr. Fox said this, or Dr. Diane, they think it's even higher, but they think about 25% of the population has something in their bodies genetically, and I think it's an HLA or something, I don't remember, that makes them what I would call mold sensitive. For some of our listeners, I think a lot of times maybe you have a teenage daughter that's starting to hit puberty, and they start acting out and having behavioral issues. And I think a lot of times we just ignore it. Not only we ignore it, but we poo-poo it away, and we're like, oh, that's just, that's what happens when girls are at that age. And sometimes, and I guess my point is sometimes it could be, there might be a mold infestation. Dr. Fox, the reason she even went down the whole mold road was her son was showing all these health issues, and it ended up being mold in the attic above his room. And so it just kind of brings up something for our listeners that, once again, instead of just saying, my child's just a toddler, or they're only 15, their brains aren't fully developed. Maybe there is a mold concern and only that one child or one person in the home is being affected.
Absolutely. Well, it's so important to see understanding how to manage stress around toxic mold sickness the way you talk about it as a CSI investigation.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't just one thing, and it oftentimes the mold sickness triggers other things. So if you were sort of borderline, kind of on the curb of getting some sort of autoimmune or a Lyme, mold could send you over the edge and now you've got lupus, or mold could send you over the edge. Now you've got, Lyme, or vice versa. I think Dr. Fox talked about that. So it's not even that you're just managing the toxic mold. You're managing all the other things going on between your nervous system and your immune system and then your family system. You're managing all of these things that keep triggering each other and then causing additional things for you to have to do a CSI investigation on.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of, a lot of people, especially if they have mental health issues, they say, there's a trigger event.
Mm-hmm.
And, like what you're saying is that trigger could be the mold exposure. And, a lot of times it's ignored because, in my opinion, a lot of it's ignorance. Like a lot of people don't understand mold and mycotoxins and how they can affect the body.
Mm-hmm.
Like we talked about last week, a lot of times, you just get gaslit and people are like, oh, mold's been around forever. I agree. But on the other hand, the molds that we're talking about these days and mycotoxins are not typically inside of a home. And the reason we're experiencing my first book, The Mold Epidemic, is because these building materials, insulation, sheetrock, wood, they're not designed to get wet. And that's why, once we have a moisture intrusion event, we have mold. If it's toxigenic, which a lot of them are, water-related or water-damaged building materials are mostly toxic molds. Then they produce a mycotoxin. Then the mycotoxin's released, and that's anywhere in the home. But my point is from maybe a scientific point of view, mold isn't the problem, but the mycotoxin is. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think, every organism, whether it's human beings or mold, they evolve over time.
Yep, they morph.
They mutate to, and if you give any organism on Earth the opportunity to leverage something like a building material that's not natural,
mm-hmm.
to leverage that to become stronger, better, faster, more able to reproduce, it will.
Yep. And it goes back to what I was just saying. That's why, there's a trigger event. Maybe someone that's bipolar under normal circumstances was not dealing with, they lost their job, they're going through a divorce, a child dies, a parent dies. Like, there's typically a trigger event. And, once again, that's where, talking about stress, for those listening, what does stress have to do with mold? It's very stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, I understand financially it's very difficult, can be very time consuming. And I think if people don't understand, just like those that don't understand when they say mold's naturally present, well, that's true. Mold spores that are microscopic in the air are naturally present. But mold infestations that are typically not seen, they're behind the wall, that is not normal.
Absolutely. And I mean, when we talk about how do you manage the stress associated with any sort of chronic illness or toxic mold sickness, it begins with you understanding how does stress show up for you? Like, stress shows up differently, whether physically, emotionally, or behaviorally for every person. Some people feel like their heart is racing. Some people feel like they're getting a panic attack. Some people start pacing the floor. Some people feel like they can't breathe. Some people start eating out of control. So I think the first thing to manage your stress is you have to identify, how does stress typically show up for you? Sleepless nights, insomnia.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the top 5 ways that when you're stressed out due to anything in your life, when you're super stressed out, what are the top 5 ways that stress shows up for you? Because you need to know those signs. So when you catch yourself going into a state of stress, constant stress, right? But when you're really getting stressed out over this
mm-hmm.
toxic mold sickness, you need to be able to say, oh, that's a sign. And then step number 2, what are my top 5 things that show up when I'm stressed is step number 1. But step number 2 is you need to have your go-to doctors, health practitioners, healing modalities of people who give you research-backed, evidence-based understanding of what's going on with your health. So like for me, I love Dr. Tina Moore. I love Dr. Amen. He's a psychiatrist who talks about the brain and the immune system and how it affects you. Dr. Mark Hyman. I have my go-tos. Who are your go-tos?
Right.
Figure out who they are. Consume their stuff. Get the research. Dr. Peter Attia is another one I love. Get the research that they're sharing. So you have evidence-based research back that says, here are all the things I'm experiencing. Here's how my immune system affects my nervous system, affects my health. And then step number 3 is you need to figure out what are the top 5 stress reduction modalities that work for you. Some people go on a run. Some people meditate. Some people do deep breathing. Some people play video games. Like there are thousands of ways to manage your stress, but you need to find the ones that actually truly work for you. And make sure that when you catch yourself going really high stress, you use one of those things to manage it.
Exactly. And, all the things you've just said, to circle back to mold exposure, I want our listeners to understand, and I'm sure they do, but something I say all the time, mold exposure affects every one of us differently. So just because you're getting, let's say, headaches, doesn't mean that the other person who's not getting headaches, that they're not being exposed to mold either. And that's a very important thing for our listeners to understand. Like, we all are affected by mold differently. And what may make me sick might not make you sick.
Correct.
And, just to kind of go a little deeper into that, like I haven't talked about it in quite a while, but, the people that are most vulnerable to mold sickness are those that are the young, the elderly, and those with any autoimmune disorders. And, if you can try to just understand, from a further point of view, like, well, maybe, this person, doesn't mean there's something wrong, but maybe this person can be exposed to less mold than I can.
Absolutely. So. And I think having, there's research that shows that being in a peer support group, those people actually do better health outcomes wise than trying to do it on your own. Yeah. So if you can find, whether it's on Facebook or in person, which in person's always better, a peer support group of those also dealing with toxic mold who are uplifting. Let me give a caveat. Sometimes you go into Facebook groups and everybody is in the trenches of saying, this is the worst. My life will never be the same. I will never recover. You don't want to be in those support groups.
Exactly.
You want to be in uplifting, optimistic, people who've recovered, who are sharing what did they do, how did they do it. Peer groups can be super helpful. And if you haven't listened to episode 261 with Heather, who is a health coach focusing on mold, having a health coach who actually has been through it is super helpful. Who specializes in mold is super helpful. That person will help you really think through what you're experiencing and design plans to take actions that will support you.
Yeah, because next week we're actually going to talk about the coaching side of things. But, like the last question that I had on our outline was, how do you get rid of the stress? You just walked us through that. From my perspective, obviously from indoor air quality, have your home tested. And, we've talked about the ERMI, HERTSMI 2 testing. Our listeners know where I stand. I'm not saying they're not worth the money, but in my opinion, if you're going to spend the money for dust sampling and you're looking at mold species, I would do the EMMA test. Like, that's my call to action is get your home tested. An EMMA test is something you can buy from our website. You literally go, and I'll put the link in the description. You go to the website, you pay for the kit. We have the kit shipped to you. You literally get the kit with the instructions. You take the sampling. It's dust sampling. Takes you 5 minutes. You put it, and it comes in a prepackaged envelope or prepaid. You send that to Real Time Labs. We have another company that we're trying out. Hayes Microbial, I believe, is the name. Anyhow, that's a different type of mycotoxin testing, but you can literally get the kits, send them to the lab, 7 to 10 days, you have the results.
Well, and I think what you're speaking to, and this is from the movie Mary Poppins, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yep.
I think when people come to you proactively and they do a VPA with you, and that can be done online anywhere in the world, and they do mold consulting with you before they spend the $30,000 on testing alone, before they hire the wrong mold. I mean, if prevention is key here.
Yep.
Doing the fall and spring checklist, making sure you're journaling what's going on in your home, like all the things you've talked about on every podcast episode, and then scheduling time with you before they jump into all of the expensive things that then don't work, that then they're 50 grand in.
Yeah.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly. And, for the price, like for the Emma kits, for the price we sell the kits for, you can almost buy them just as cheap on their actual website. For the Emma kit, my point is we're pretty close to what you can buy it on your own, but buying it through us, you get my interpretations or evaluation of the results. And like you said, prevention is key to this. So for all our listeners, we appreciate all of you, and we hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also, on cnccontractorservices.com, find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.